Hello, this is Aaron. Welcome back to the show. My guest today is Chris Arnade. He's a really interesting guy. He has a PhD in particle physics. Then he went to work as a quant on Wall Street for about 2 decades. And he somehow got interested in some of the toughest neighborhoods in places like New York. He started spending time there, getting to know people, taking photographs, and the net result was almost an entirely new line of work for him, and a really great book I'd encourage you all to check out called Dignity, which I will put a link to buy that in the show notes. It's kind of a little bit of a how the other half lives for the modern era, designed to expose the difference between what he calls the front row kids and the back row kids, which has been one of the themes of his work. So, Chris, I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time. I've been following your work since before Dignity came out, and so I'm glad that I have you today.
Well, thank you for having me. You're in Indianapolis, and I'm not too far from you, but we're still doing this by video.
Yeah. Well, there you go. It's not as close as you think. I think you're in Michigan City or something right now. Are you walking
Correct.
through Michigan City?
I'm heading up from here to effectively Chicago,
Yeah.
through Gary and Calumet and South Chicago, that sort of area.
Yeah. So, one of the things that you've been doing probably for a couple years now is walking around, walking the world. You basically would go to a city and you'll just walk all throughout the city, or you'll even walk between cities. Now, as you're walking, this is going to take you through Gary, Hammond, East Chicago, a lot of these places, heading into Chicago. And again, you're seeing cities from a perspective a lot of people don't have, we don't usually have, and seeing sides of cities there. What motivated you to start doing all of these walking tours?
Yeah, well, thank you, first of all. Yeah, when you talk about my kind of early career, going from particle physics to Wall Street to kind of whatever it is I do now, I kind of call it pop ethnography or urbanism. Um, Effectively, each step of that process was me kind of becoming trying to become less of a math nerd and more of a kind of people person, and to think about problems and think about issues in a different way. I was always early on very kind of math came easy for me, and and that's the kind of way that I looked at the world. Is I think a friend of mine has nicknamed that spreadsheet brain, which is kind of looking at problems and very analytically, very quantitatively, um, and really not kind of the people were just widgets, or kind of aggregate parts of statistics, part of the statistics. And I started realizing that during my time on Wall Street, especially, I would deal with stress or relax simply by going on long walks, just very long walks. When I first arrived in New York City, I'd never been there before, so I took the A train up to the Cloisters, and I walked the entire length of Broadway down to the Fulton Street Market, and then over the Brooklyn Bridge, just because I wanted to know the city, and that was kind of always my way to kind of learn about a city. And similarly, when I was on Wall Street, I traveled a lot for Wall Street. I was focused on what's called distressed debt, emerging markets, Russia, Turkey, Argentina, Indonesia. And again, when I would kind of go on a business trip, I would try my best to get out of the hotel and go out on my own. And the thing about walking is, you can't fast forward. You have to see everything. And often the parts we fast forward through are the most revealing or the most interesting part of a city, um, because often that's where a lot of people live, and a lot of people who aren't usually heard from live. And it's often in those boring kind of parts where you're forced to confront issues you may not want to have confronted, or you just weren't made aware of, and you really see the city in a way. I think of almost every city as, less, some cities more than others, but in some ways they're often just, federations of kind of different neighborhoods stick together, and so you stitch together. So when you walk, you can see each of those federations, um, and so there was always a learning part of it. that was always in the background, and the relaxation part. And then as my Wall Street career went on and on and on, and I became more and more disillusioned with the industry, I started focusing more on the walks. And someone gave me a camera. Around some point in 2006, 2007, they gave me a camera to take me on my walks. And I just, because I was often finding out on these walks that it was the people I met that was more interesting than the buildings I saw. Um, and I just started taking pictures of people, and they would then start telling me their stories. So I started scratching down little notes about their stories, and the whole thing evolved effectively into by 2012, where I was effectively, unbeknownst to me, had turned into something of a journalist, I guess, because I didn't know what that was really. I mean, I kind of knew what it was, but I wasn't intending to be that. So but for me, what was so refreshing was it was a new way of learning. It was just a very different way of seeing the world, from, instead of looking at it from a computer, looking at it from basically the bottom up instead of the top down.
Well, the cloisters are in pretty far north Manhattan. And I don't know exactly when this was, but your Wikipedia page says you started on Wall Street in 1993, which was pre Giuliani, New York. That was like record era for murders in New York. And that walk goes through some areas that would have been a little rougher at the time. How did you relate to that? Did people think you were crazy walking through these neighborhoods, or did you know what you were getting into? Or
I wasn't entirely naive. I had done my PhD in Baltimore, and I walked through some of the worst neighborhoods in Baltimore. I've never really been personally scared. I I've always ended up making friends in those in neighborhoods, and kind of, some people say I'm very gregarious. I don't really know, um, but but I also am not an idiot. I know where not. I know when to not push it, when to not when I know when there's a sense of I'm not welcome. Look, a lot of times I am the crazy white guy, and most of those neighborhoods I'm in are Hispanic and Black, and I'm clearly not that. But you know, I focus on how I focus on churches. I focus on dive bars. I focus on places where they're generally more accepting of people, as long as they kind of show a kind of an openness and a willingness to kind of, get engage on people, on not in a condescending way, not in a preachy way, but kind of in a genuine way. But I personally have never had any problems. And you talk about the crazy, people think I'm crazy. Some people think I'm crazy, and that's often to your benefit, because I don't dress. I don't. Uh, I'm very careful how I dress. I've never wore a watch. I've never shown any outward signs of wealth. I kind of go in a very kind of, almost, kind of like, just almost in a just a very, what I hope is a genuine way. But yeah, the New York of the '93 and '94 was, very, very different than the New York of it is now. And when we talk about the problems of New York, and we can talk about, that perhaps later. But yeah, I don't think people know. I was catching the tail end of a very, very, very bad period. And for for whatever reason, I've managed not to have any problems in any of these neighborhoods.
you mentioned being the math nerd and you're experiencing the world in a new way, but you're also gregarious and start talking to people. I think about New York as a place where people aren't necessarily looking to strike up conversations with strangers. And I would probably be intimidated to just start talking to people, in some of these neighborhoods where I'm not from. How did you get in like habit of start talking to people? Or is there like a method to just opening like a casual conversation that is not going to like
Y-
put people on the back foot or whatever?
it was interesting. I forgot where I read it about Tom Wolfe. Because where I ended up focusing my time mostly in New York was in Hunts Point, which is, statistically was at the time the worst neighborhood in New York. And it's also not coincidentally, it's also where Tom Wolfe did a lot of his work, his research for, Bonfire of the Vanities. When he wrote that book, he went into Bronx criminal court, often for I think 3 to 4 months to kind of do kind of what he thought was field work for his book. Because if for your readers, if you haven't read it, um, an important incident in the book occurs in Hunts Point, actually, just right near Hunts Point, in the Bronx. Um, if you Google a picture of him, he wore this immaculate white suit,
He's quite the
and
dandy.
yeah, quite the dandy. And he himself is, they would say in the Bronx, you're white mofo. I
Mhm.
mean, he sticks out. But he said that was intentional. He said, they treated me almost like an alien, and that brought people to me. And that's exactly what kind of worked with me. Is my process has always been to kind of, if I'm in a new neighborhood, I spend time in the local McDonald's. I just go there and sit there and type on my computer, if I have one, or charge my phone or whatever and people come up to me, because I'm the weirdo in the corner. Like who's this guy, this white guy in this corner with this camera or this computer? And that's often where a lot of the conversations came from initially. Is I don't push stuff, or people would just come up, just come up to me and say, like, literally one of the most important people in the book came up to me and literally said, "You're a white guy. What are you doing
Yeah.
here?" And so I just kind of smiled and kind of went up and talked to them. So there is a certain level of me being so clearly an outsider brings attention to you and questions, and you engage those questions in kind of good faith. But also, I will just barge into someone said I'm happiest when I'm in a place I probably shouldn't be. I'll just barge into, like, when I was in Milwaukee in the North Side, where I spent most of the time in this the historically traditionally black neighborhood. Um, there's a bar there, the Scorpion Lounge, I think it is. And I just walked in and just, it was a bit awkward for about 15, 20 seconds. But once people realized that I was who I was and what I was doing, and, they just kind of engaged me, and that I wasn't there to kind of, for furtive means, I was there to kind of really just kind of just talk to people.
There's a very long tradition of what you might call street photography. And there's all different kinds. There's sort of, you know, just random man on the street. There was the fashion photography thing that was big for a while. You might be familiar with the sartorialist, this guy who
Right.
took pictures, who I actually lived on my dorm floor freshman year. I really didn't know him, but do you see yourself as in kind of like your work is in dialogue with any kind of like street, city or street photographers of the past, or is this just something that's more personal to you?
It's more personal, and the thing was, again, this is never intended to be a book. It never intended to be anything. Like, it was just me kind of curiously doing my thing, and I caught the early wave of beginning of social media. My first account was on Flickr, and I just started posting kind of what were just small, almost my notes on each person, beneath the photo. And the photo was a central point. Flickr is a photo sharing site,
Mhm.
um, but the words started growing beneath the photos, and then it just evolved into kind of articles where the photos became secondary to the words. And it was all relatively organic. I had no real grand plan. I look back now and it really was just me kind of doing something and not really knowing what I was doing. And I made some mistakes in retrospect. I wish I had done things slightly differently, or what have you. But it was just kind of this slow kind of learning process where I was clearly learning how to interact with the word. I was kind of doing my own journalism degree, on my own, and the entire process was, and in reference to other people, I intentionally don't look at other people's stuff, because I kind of want to go in without kind of, I don't want to go in with kind of preconceptions. I kind of find that kind of that coming in with the preconceptions kind of paints how you see a place. So but in terms of those, some of those, I've seen those, and I think I admire anybody who does. I recognize kind of how much work it is when it may not look like that much work. But I kind of found that, but by 2012 and 2013 and 2014, after kind of 4 years of doing it, I kind of wanted to spend more time in a place than just walk through it. I would start focusing, I'd go into a neighborhood in the Bronx. I spent 3 to 4 years there, from basically 2011 to 2015. And then as I started expanding into other parts of the United States, like Buffalo, where I went to Buffalo for a month, and I over 4 different trips of a week, where I would kind of focus on walking through certain neighborhoods of Buffalo, and or then I went to Selma, Alabama, or El Paso, or any like a whole host of different places. I would spend at least 2 weeks to 10 days there, and kind of to drill down a little bit more into a particular neighborhood or a particular town.
You learned a lot of stuff. Now, originally, we were supposed to do this when you were at a stopping over point at a McDonald's. We were actually going to film in a McDonald's, which I thought was pretty good because McDonald's plays a big role in your book and in the lives of these people. What did you discover about the role of McDonald's in these communities?
Yeah, McDonald's effectively is, in many cases, act as the town square or the community center for a lot of very poor neighborhoods, where that certainly was the case in Hunts Point, which just kind of became the archetype for a lot of my work, where it was kind of it's a fully functional space that allows people to kind of integrate into community. um, and has I didn't intend to highlight McDonald's as these community centers, but I found myself in them for the same reason they were in them, which was, I need to charge my phone again. I need to use the restroom. They have good coffee, good inexpensive coffee, and and I could just escape the heat or the cold. And so, I in the Bronx and the Hunts Point, I would kind of did this 4 year project, I guess, following, basically 30 to 40 homeless people, a sort of street family, and often meeting them and talking to them and spending time with them was a lot of the time was in the McDonald's. And so, when I started doing what I did in the Bronx across the U.S., which was I did that for about 4 or 5 years up until like 2018. Going to neighborhoods all over the U.S. and walking around them. I've again found myself in McDonald's, and then so it started becoming the point of the. I would simply start in the McDonald's. If I went to a different neighborhood, I would start and make it my base. And I wrote a piece, I don't remember when it was now, 2016, 2017, 20, called, McDonald's as a Community Center. And, I had been meaning to write it for like 3 years, but I didn't write it because I thought it was so obvious. And it kind of it was the piece that went the most viral for me, and probably ended up helping my career the most because it really resonated with people. I think a lot of people hadn't seen McDonald's as this kind of communal center. People had seen McDonald's only as a negative. They didn't see the positive in McDonald's. And so when I did write Dignity, the working title was, you'll see in the book if you read it that McDonald's factors a lot in the book. The working title was called, Everything You Want to Learn About the United States You Can Learn in McDonald's. And I kind of generally agree and still believe that you can learn so much about the U.S. By simply sitting in the McDonald's and talking to the people in the McDonald's.
Yeah, and it's one of the counterintuitive things that you bring to it because I think a lot of people from the educated classes would hold McDonald's in contempt. It's like look down on McDonald's and, maybe even look down at the people who are in McDonald's. But you kind of tell like a more positive story of McDonald's,
Yeah,
not just as a
yeah,
purveyor of junk food, but as a place that provides a third place in communities that don't have Starbucks and other fancy Thanks.
Yeah, McDonald's is. I'm an unabashed supporter of them at this point, and again, I don't get paid by McDonald's. um, they do know what I'm doing, and I have gotten more integrated with the corporation in terms of understanding them because I basically have a PhD in McDonald'sology at this point. Um, but I've probably been in like 2,000 franchises around the world at this stage. But I mean, I generally respect what they do. I really do think they, you know, I don't know if it's. I think some of it's a corporate philosophy, but I think it's more than that in the sense that a lot of the employees at McDonald's are people who come from the community, and it does provide them. I've met plenty of employees who are now been there for 40 years, and it's given them a really good life. And it's the demographic of the employees who've been there for 40 years who's have a good life is someone who started at 17. Um, you know, kind of someone from a broken family in an African American community or a Black community who start at 17, and it's given them a life. It's given them, you know, they've moved up to the point where they're now a franchise owner, or they're a or they're a manager of two to three different stores. So there really is kind of the employees are of the community in many ways. And I think a lot of the customers recognize that that's kind of the strength between the customers and the employees. They have a churn model. They scoop up a lot of employees and they discard a lot of them, or a lot of them self-eject. But a few of them, who it really works for, it can be a fantastic career. And I remember I actually met a lot of the people, senior management, one time. When they after my book had come out, they read and a lot of them had all started 16, 17, 18 years old, 20 years old, and 30, 40 years later, here they were, kind of in the court at the corporate level of McDonald's. So I think they do a lot of good in communities. I understand the limitation here. I understand the strength of small family businesses that McDonald's kind of competes with, but that's not the model we have in the U.S. That just isn't.
What would you say? I mean, it's pretty broad, and we talked about McDonald's. There's so many interesting little things that you learned in these communities. Uh, but I want to save some time to talk about some other topics. So I just wanted to kind of just maybe ask you just talk about like what are the things, the one or two or three things that you think it's most important for people in the quote unquote front row, the educated, successful professional classes to know about people in those kinds of communities.
Yeah, I think at least in the U.S., I can say that you know in the aggregate, people are good. And the aggregate, people know what they want. At the individual level, I think you'll be shocked at how ignorant people can be of issues in general. But in the aggregate, they kind of have a kind of what there's a group common sense that I think is very healthy, and I think in a democracy that's very important. I think number two, and this is certainly in the U.S., is I think they know they can it's kind of hard to really explain to people in the front row, kind of people, the educated class, how they really do feel like they're being looked down on, in terms of they feel like there's in general a sense of contempt towards them, or at the best a sense of kind of condescending good. I'm going to help you, but they don't feel like they themselves as individuals or as people are being respected. I think that drives a lot of the politics in the U.S. That there's this real sense of kind of they feel like they're being kind of reprimanded. The school analogy is what I use a school analogy for a reason. I think the largest divide in the U.S. is not about race, not about it's about education level. And I've been saying this for almost a decade now, and I feel like events have kind of proven that to be correct. I think if you look at how politics is playing in the U.S., I think there's a real sense, you know, a black kid in Buffalo who, you know, only graduated from high school is more similar to a white kid in kind of Tennessee who also only graduated than they are to kind of a PhD at Cornell,
Hmm.
regardless of their skin color. Um, and I do think that there's a real the divide between what I call the front and the back, between, you know, myself, an educated elite. You know, I have a PhD. I think a lot of your listeners might be in a similar situation, have postgraduate degrees. The front row is easier to define as kind of people with postgraduate degrees from kind of higher institutions of learning. That really affects your worldview almost at an epistemological level, how what you consider to kind of truth, what you consider to be correct, how you view the world. So I kind of see, you know, in anthropology they call them ethnographic types, you know, kind of almost cartoonish, you know, cartoonish kind of stand-ins, archetypes. And I really do think there's just a huge difference between somebody who is only has a high school degree versus somebody who has a PhD, and just how they look at the world and how they view their own role in the world. Um, and that causes these political differences in the U.S. that are almost are not going to go not are only going to grow stronger, or the differences are only going to magnify as kind of we separate ourselves socially. You know, when I kind of came up with this front row back row division, I was talking to somebody who disagreed with me, a really smart guy, but you know, we were doing kind of a online or a debate, and you know, they just mentioned they actually said, you know, they thought about my idea and they said, yeah, you're right. You know, these kind of divisions show up in marriage data, and you know, the idea when I grew up in the 70s, you know, interracial marriage was one of those things that was kind of still stigmatized. It's no longer stigmatized, not in the back row, certainly. You know, you see all sorts of interracial couplings, but you don't see intereducational marriages. You know,
Hmm.
I do not think a professor of, you know, chemistry from Cornell is going to marry a high school dropout. Or you know, I just don't think that's just those are just
No, we
rare
don't
and
see a
rare
lot of
these
that.
days. No, so you know what I learned at a kind of at a political level is just how big the differences is. At a personal level, you know, uh, it the whole process made me come back to to the church again at a personal level. I saw how important faith is. I mean, how good people are. And so, you know, I kind of went in an atheist and came out kind of,
Mm.
you know, not the best Catholic in the world, but someone who tries.
No, well, that's great. Well, again, Chris's book is called Dignity. There's a link to buy it in the show notes. You'll want to pick it up. There's lots written about it as well online. And I'll put a link to his Twitter feed in the show notes. You know, you've been doing a lot of walking through cities. You did a walk through Indianapolis, and I actually sent your write up to a bunch of people at the Chamber of Commerce and all kinds of people around. And so you've been in a lot of cities in the U.S. and you've been in a lot of cities overseas. And you made a comment, uh, and sort of recapitulated it, even maybe even today, that America is becoming a third world country. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, the it's kind of you know, I spend a lot of my time in work. As a child, I actually lived in a lot of the third world, and as an adult, that's kind of what I did in banking. Was I kind of focused on Brazil, Argentina, um, you know, sub-Saharan Africa, um, and you have in those countries you have these big political divides that are kind of defined by kind of what I would call a kind of an elite minority that kind of you know, separates itself from the majority of the country, physically but also intellectually. And I think that's the case in the U.S. We've had that kind of that would, to me, would be the front row kind of this kind of, the cartoonish conservative version is the out of touch kind of academic. But I think it also, it cuts it, certainly in 2016 it cut across party lines. I think the archetype was kind of in many ways a Jeb Bush and a Hillary Clinton, who were supposed to be the candidates of the time.
Right.
People forget, you know, who are quite similar in many ways. If you look at their kind of background, they're kind of globalist. Their kind of community is less centered in the U.S. and more centered around the world. As people who are like them, who have you know who have they're as comfortable in kind of Geneva as they are in New York City, and they're less comfortable than if you drop them into kind of Selma, Alabama, or
Hmm.
kind of or Portsmouth, Ohio. Um, and so that division, that kind of out of touch kind of um, elite majority minority, you see that in emerging markets. And so what you get in the politics of these is kind of this cynicism where you get kind of ping ponging back and forth between the kind of the angry mob, which is what they're called, versus the kind of elite majority, and they ping pong back in power. And politics doesn't become about building a cohesive union; it becomes about retribution and corruption. And you see that in the U.S. I mean, I think there's, but first and foremost, it starts with a large inequality. And when I say this, people always say, well, they throw out data about the middle class in the U.S. We've gotten wealthy as a country, and so our poverty rates are shockingly, I should say, are stunningly good, low, and that's good. That's fantastic. We've overall kind of become a much wealthier country, but it's not just about money. It's about kind of social status. It's about kind of cultural issues. I've been saying now for 10 to 12 years that politics is not about economics. It's about cultural issues, and those cultural issues that people in the front row kind of scoff at as things that are back in 2016. Back during the very, I was one of the few people who said Trump was probably going to win back in 2016, and you know, that a lot of that was based on just cultural issues. It wasn't based on money. People would say, "Well, but we're a wealthy country." The poor, the back row has never been wealthier, though. That's true, but they still feel a sense of scorn. They still feel like they're, quote, out of power, and they still feel like some of the cultural issues or some of the issues that are non-economic are driving their vote. And I think, as I said, almost everybody in the U.S. votes against their economic interest. You know, and if somebody votes against their economic interest, maybe you don't really know what their interest is.
Hmm.
you know, um, Maybe their interest isn't economics, and so I think that also is true in emerging markets. So, although again, we have the advantage of wealth, where and in some senses, that's made us kind of more prone to fight over the petty things than the fight over the more substantial things.
It seems to me that there are a lot of areas where we're just becoming more dysfunctional, like a sort of a developing world country. Peter Thiel gave a speech, several years ago where he sort of made a riff on American exceptionalism. He says, "Yeah, we're exceptional, but we're exceptionally bad. And we're exceptionally overweight. Maybe we have an exceptionally high number of people living in single family homes or single parent homes." Now that's he didn't exactly say that one, but you can say there are a lot of areas now where we're like an outlier in a negative way. And one of them that I think you commented on is like our public transit, some of our public amenities, where we always see these pictures of gleaming transit systems in other countries, and even in like not especially wealthy countries, they have like highly functional public transit. And then we had this like horrific killing in Charlotte on the light rail line. It just seems like, quite apart from just dangerousness, which we have, it just seems like this idea, it's this disorder. Things don't work here. Our public health infrastructure didn't really work during the pandemic. What do you see in terms of the US as sort of a functional society with functional services compared to other countries that you experience?
Yeah, so in the last 4 or 5 years, I've been doing what I did in the U.S. or around the world, and so I've been traveling a lot, and I've written most of my focus has been writing on the rest of the world. And yeah, I mean, I have a series of pieces called "Why the U.S. Can't Have Nice Things," and we don't have nice things. Our kind of our the common good, so to speak, that we have is it's much better in Europe, and it's much better in poorer countries. We're immensely wealthy, but we're also immensely kind of prone to kind of ignore the common good. Our I ride buses everywhere. If I'm not walking, I'm riding buses. I rode Greyhound buses from New York City to Chicago the last time I came here in piecemeal. And that's where I stopped in Indianapolis again for a day. I think I came from I forgot where I'd come from. I came from Columbus, Ohio. I went uh, from New York to Harrisburg, Harrisburg to Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh to Columbus, Columbus to Indianapolis, Indianapolis to Fort Wayne, Fort Wayne to here, in Greyhound buses. And when you see the cities in that way, when you're kind of dropped off at the Greyhound stop, and just walking around downtown in downtown Indianapolis, that kind of just, or just staying down there, it's depressing. We have this kind of stubborn stubborn part of the back. One of my disservices of my book was the back row was lumped into one entity. It's not. There's degradation. There's different back rows, and then there's effectively the working poor, then there's the dependent poor, and they're very, very different. They have the same mentality in terms of the worldview, but their situation is very different. um, and we have a very stubborn dependent poor in the U.S. who, um, you know, are causing a lot of problems, and they're in a lot of pain themselves. And I you don't have to spend you don't have to spend too much time in Vietnam or Indonesia or you know Mongolia to see how bad we have it, how much kind of disorder and how much kind of filth and how much kind of violence we accept. um, you know Mongolia is really poor, but
Yeah.
and yet they have better. I feel more comfortable on a bus in Mongolia, than I do in kind of like on a bus in Indianapolis. And so that's a real problem for the U.S. has. And that horrific video that just came out a week and a half ago or 2 weeks ago or whatever. Um, it doesn't have to be that way. It just doesn't have to be that way. We have an acceptance of we have a tolerance for amount of disorder and amount of violence in this country that I have to tell foreigners who are about to visit here that no, it's not a Hollywood image of the violence in the U.S. You really do have to be careful where you go in the U.S. And we can accept it in the U.S. We seem to be comfortable accepting it because it's so localized. When you walk through a place, if you walk 15 miles through a town, um, literally across the town from beltway to beltway, you can see how quickly you can be in these wonderful neighborhoods where the crime rate is almost nil. It's almost kind of we're talking about you know violent crimes that are kind of statistically in the almost never happen category. Then you walk 3 to 4 blocks and you're in places where you're talking about 50 murders per 100,000. Kind of numbers that lead the world. Um, so that disorder and that kind of crime is just so hyper localized in the U.S., which allows it to if you're not kind of if you know where not to go, if you know where, then we seem to be willing to accept it because it's not happening to us.
The other thing about you mentioned Greyhound, which is a great example of just the thinking of America and how we operate. I guess some private equity company bought Greyhound and they figured out that the real estate was worth more than the actual bus operations because Greyhound owned a lot of stations. And so they essentially, which is very common today, split Greyhound into a real estate arm and a transportation arm, and basically have been selling off all the bus stations for other purposes. And now there are no bus stations in a lot of cities anymore. And it's like if you want to wait for a bus, you have to just wait on the street, maybe in the rain and the cold, et cetera. It's not like that everywhere because they don't always use their own stations. But it seems like we have this mentality of devouring the commons. Maybe it's a little too, I don't know. I don't want to sound like I'm too like, too anti-capitalism or something, but it seems like this idea of just liquidating, liquidating the common good in a sense to make a buck seems to be our mentality.
Yeah, I mean, I experienced that in my Greyhound rides. Is you know, you just dropped off at the Walmart Plaza, mm, you know, 20 miles outside, 15 miles outside of town sometimes. In some senses, I understand what Greyhound's doing because that's kind of where their clientele is now. When you ride the Greyhound, it's people who downtown, who don't necessarily live downtown. Um, you know, Downtown Indianapolis is one place which still has its Greyhound station. It's right near the it's right across from the stadium.
Yeah, they're
Um,
based in the old train station, so that's like a city-owned property. They didn't own it, so they still use it. It's just like they use Port
yeah,
Authority in New York still.
but they also will just drop you off in front of I guess the Richard Luger's
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
there's just a sign there just on the street, and so you know but given that their clientele is effectively economically on the very very bottom, kind of bottom, I guess 150th even, you know the hotels they tend to stay in now are out at the interstate. They stay in the Super 8 or the Motel 6, which is they have a Section 8 housing voucher and they get to stay there for 2 months, and so um, they don't really stay downtown. And so, in some senses, it's fitting to their clientele, but it's still like, again, it's just a public good issue where the kind of we do not think in terms of what's for the common good. We think about what's good for a very select few percentage of the country. And there is a question of just you know I'm very involved in urbanism circles, as you are. I think and the thing is there are some desires of American urbanists that just are not going to play out here in this country, because we have a very different attitude towards kind of how we view kind of the common good, and how we view kind of how we want to live. I think in many cases, I think there's a revealed preference in the of a lot of Americans for suburban, for how a ranch house on a piece of property that's not a ranch. um,
Exactly.
you know, um, yeah, I that's not my preference. I am an elite when it comes to kind of my urbanism taste, but I recognize when my tastes are contrary to the majority of people.
Yeah, and again, when the urban spaces have all of this disorder and have all of these crazy things happening, and we can't even have like an honest conversation about it, uh, I think it makes people. One of the things from Bonfire of the Vanities, Tom Wolfe talks about something to the effect of, if you want to live in New York City, you have to, insulate, insulate, insulate. And I think that's
Yeah,
what a lot of people are doing. They're insulating themselves
yeah,
in some of these
the
places.
you know my frustration is the urbanism world is that you can't have nice things unless you have unless you have a high trust society, and we don't have a high trust society. We seem not to have an inch in we seem not to have an in you can build trust, by the way, through policy. It's not like something that's just magically disappears and comes and goes, but we seem to have given a preference. I mean, quite honestly, it's like, you, unless you unless you there are consequences for bad actions, there's going to continue to be bad actions, and it's going to ruin it for everybody. It doesn't it a bus being on a bus is going to be ruined by one jerk. one out of 100, one out of 1,000. And, people are not, there's a hurdle to get people to ride bus public transportation. I'm often the only person. I'm well, what am I going not often. I am almost always the only person who's riding a bus by choice,
Hmm.
because I like it. That's not, there's a hurdle there to get to people to ride buses, and you need to provide them a clean, pleasant experience 100% of the time, not 93% of the time, not 95% of the time, 100% of the time, or people are just not going to take the bus, and I don't blame them. So you can't tolerate antisocial behavior, you can't tolerate crime, you can't tolerate disorder. There has to be a reckoning in the US with, you can't have what I call a libertarian understanding of personal responsibility and a socialized concept of politics. Those two are incoherent together. You can only have shared goods, which is what public transport is what third spaces are, parks, unless people know how to behave in them. I mean, Japan's the perfect, is the perfect example of that. But you can see it in Korea, you can see it, and you can even see it in Jakarta. You don't need to go to fancy Japan to see it. You can go to a lot of other countries that are not as wealthy as Japan, where there is a shared understanding of kind of like, we're all in this together. And I have some, there are some rules on my behavior that I have to follow, or else I'm going to be either ostracized culturally and socially, or I'm going to be put in jail.
Well, I could talk about this sort of stuff all day, but I want to be respectful of your time. I just want to ask one last question. Our politicians at the state, local, national level, what do you think they should do to start moving things in a healthier direction?
Um, I mean, I don't want to be of the moment, but that video exposes a policy choice of ours that is jaw dropping to me in terms of its idiocy. Look, if people read Dignity, I'm um, I'm very forgiving of people's mistakes. I'm very I take I think we should give everybody the benefit of the doubt a few times. Um, you know, we should contextualize issues, but there comes a point when, if you break the law 14 times and you show that you have no interest in being a good member of society, there should be consequences for that. You shouldn't be at some point you have to mandate people to facilities that against their will. I mean, you just have to. Um, or there's no point in kind of continually giving people the benefit of the doubt over and over and over. You got to extend grace for first few transgressions. You can contextualize people's decisions, to give them the benefit of the doubt once or twice or three times or four times, but 14 times, no, you can't. People need to be, you can't accept disorder at the level we have accepted disorder. To go to your own city, Richard Lugar Park is depressing as hell. It's an open air drug market, and the police stand by and do nothing other than just administer Narcan when someone overdoses. And that's a level of grace that I think we've exceeds where I'm comfortable.
Yeah, and Richard Luger Plaza is literally the public plaza of our city hall. So it's not like this is happening in some out of the way place. It's literally happening in the middle of
You
downtown.
started talking to me initially about, like, do I feel awkward and do I feel safe? You know, Richard Lugar Park is a place I walk through Plaza, sorry, 3 or 4 or 5 times a day in my 2 days there. The last time I was there, but even then, there were times when I'm like, I can't be here. It's too depressing. It's just too chaotic. Um, I mean, you can't accept that level of it's not. I will also say, as somebody who spends a lot of time or spent a lot of time around the homeless population, you're not doing them a favor here. This is not good for them. Letting people live in their own filth is not, that's not harm reduction. It may come under the guise of harm reduction, but you're putting them at a lot more risk, and putting them in a lot more despair, and putting them in a lot more pain than mandating them to a facility where they can go through the 2 to 3 week awful process of detoxing, but a month later, they're in a much better place. This kind of harm reduction is misnamed. You're putting them in a lot of risk that that it's not fair to them, and it's not fair to the general public.
I agree. We have to do something about a lot of these people who are, severely mentally ill, severely substance addicted, and it's not good for anybody to just leave in the current situation. So hopefully somebody takes that action. Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining me. My guest today has been Chris Arnade, author of Dignity. Buy it in the show notes. Give him a follow on X. Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.